A real Texas father doesn't raise his voice when he's angry. He goes dead quiet. And on the day my own son stood on the back patio in Highland Park and told me he wished I'd never been born into his life, I didn't yell either. I put my fork down, folded my cloth napkin, set it neatly beside my plate, and gave him exactly what he asked for. My name is Garrett Vance. I run Vance Heavy Machinery, a network of 4 commercial truck and equipment dealerships spread across the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. I didn't inherit an acre or a dollar. I built the entire enterprise from a rusting, windswept used truck lot off Industrial Boulevard, working 16-hour days in the Texas heat. For 30 years, I woke up at 5 o'clock every single morning so my son, Colton, would never know what it feels like to wonder if the electricity bill was going to get paid. I gave him a life in Highland Park, complete with manicured lawns, a custom stone pool, and doors that opened automatically to whatever ambition he fancied that week. You'd think 30 years of sweat equity buys a father a little foundational respect. Turns out, in modern Dallas, it just buys you a Father's Day dinner where your 26-year-old kid looks you in the eye and tells you he wishes you never existed. The morning had started peacefully enough. Father's Day in North Texas, 68 degrees before the summer heat kicked in, not a cloud in the sky. My wife, Eleanor, had set the long teak table on the back patio with her finest china, treating an afternoon family brisket like we were hosting the governor of Texas. I was sitting on the porch with a black coffee, watching the sprinklers sweep across the lawn in the exact same rhythmic arc they've taken for 20 years. Eleanor came out in her silk robe, kissed the crown of my head, and murmured, "Try to go easy on him today, Garrett. It's his day off." "When have I ever been hard on the boy, Eleanor?" I asked. She gave me that look, the one honed over 30 years of marriage that carries more weight than a courtroom verdict. Yesterday about the maintenance invoice on his truck. "That wasn't a conversation, Garrett. That was an interrogation." "That wasn't an interrogation," I replied evenly. "That was basic accounting." "It's Father's Day," she whispered, touching my shoulder. "Let the numbers rest." I promised her I would. I should have known better than to make a promise about my son before Colton himself showed up to set the day on fire. Colton arrived an hour late, of course. Walking through the side gate with his new girlfriend, Sienna Croft, draped over his arm like an expensive piece of silk he'd rented just for the afternoon. Sienna was polished, sharp, and carried herself with the kind of calculated grace that makes a businessman instinctively audit his surroundings. In the 8 months they'd been dating, I'd learned precisely one thing about Sienna Croft. She never asked a single genuine question about anyone else. She didn't ask about the heavy machinery business, didn't ask Eleanor about her garden. She just observed, scanned, and calculated, like an appraiser quietly pricing out the furniture in real time. "Happy Father's Day, big guy," Colton said, clapping me on the shoulder with the loose, easy confidence of a boy who has never had a check bounce in his entire life. "Smells incredible out here." "Your mother did the heavy lifting," I said, rising to shake his hand. "I just managed the fire." Sienna let out a soft, rehearsed laugh, half a second too late, like she was translating Texas hospitality from a foreign language. "You have an absolute paradise here, Garrett." Colton always talks about growing up in Highland Park like it was something out of a magazine. "It wasn't a magazine, Sienna," I noted mildly, taking my seat at the head of the table. "It was $24 million in commercial equipment loans and 30 years of 60-hour work weeks." Colton cleared his throat, a light warning flashing in his eyes. "Let her give you a compliment, Dad. I'm agreeing with her. The place is great." We made it through the brisket with reasonable surface peace, easy talk. Eleanor talking about her preservation board meetings. Colton checking his personal phone under the linen napkin every 4 minutes. Sienna kept steering the conversation with practiced ease, asking Eleanor about the landscaping, asking about our summer cabin in Colorado. Warm stuff. She was exceptionally good at warm. It was just never aimed at anyone without a purpose attached to it. Then came the dessert. As Eleanor set down the peach cobbler, Colton cleared his throat the exact way he used to when he was 10 years old, and about to admit he'd backed his ATV into the fence post. "So, Dad," Colton began, leaning his elbows on the teak table, "Sienna and I wanted to talk to you about something big. An opportunity." I set my water glass down. "What kind of opportunity, son?" "A real estate venture," Colton said, his voice lifting with unearned excitement. "Sienna's inner circle in Austin is capitalizing on the short-term rental market down near the hill country. Insane yields, Dad. High-end luxury properties, fully managed. We just need capital to secure our allocation in the upcoming funding round." "How much capital?" I asked quietly. Letting the silence settle over the patio, Colton glanced at Sienna. Sienna took a slow sip of her sweet tea, her eyes fixed on me with cool expectation. $240,000, Colton said. "We need you to fund 60% of our buy-in." I didn't flinch. I let the number breathe in the humid Texas air. $240,000, I repeated. "For a short-term rental flip you heard about through her friends." "Not just friends, Garrett. Sienna chimed in smoothly, leaning forward. It's an established syndicate called Lone Star Asset Group. They've already acquired 4 prime properties in Travis County this year. My associate Michelle has been in since January, and she's already seeing 12% annualized distributions. Michelle, I said flatly. And does Michelle have a last name? Garrett, Eleanor said, softly, her hand drifting toward my knee beneath the table. I'm asking a standard business question, Eleanor, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Sienna. A private syndicate raising $250,000 tranches from individual retail investors usually leaves a paper trail. But when Colton mentioned this group to his mother 2 weeks ago, I decided to run a routine background check. I didn't find an active LLC registration with the Texas Secretary of State. I didn't find a licensed broker of record, and I certainly didn't find any county deed filings for those 4 Travis County properties. Colton's face flushed a deep, sudden red. You did a background check? You pulled records on my business partners? He whipped his head toward his mother. You told him? I told you about that in confidence, Mom. Eleanor didn't flinch. She met her son's angry gaze with steady, sorrowful eyes. I told your father because $240,000 is not a casual favor, Colton, and because we are a family that protects one another. Don't blame your mother, Colton. I cut in, my voice dropping into a register that usually clears a boardroom floor. She brought it to me because she was worried you were stepping into a pit. And she was right, but it's worse than just an unregistered shell company, son. I had my corporate legal counsel pull the draft investor agreement Sienna emailed you on Thursday. I reached into my breast pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and slid it across the white tablecloth. Lone Star Asset Group isn't just an unverified entity, I said, pointing directly at the highlighted paragraph on page 3. Sienna's associates structured this contract so that you, Colton Vance, are signing as the sole personal guarantor under an unlimited joint and several liability clause. That means if this phantom entity defaults, misses a tax payment, or gets sued, the creditors cannot touch Sienna, Michelle, or the syndicate. They come directly after your personal bank accounts, your credit, and your assets. You aren't being invited in as an investor, son. You're being brought in as the designated financial fall guy. Sienna's posture stiffened instantly, her warm smile vanishing into an icy calculating stare. Colton looked down at the highlighted clause, then up at me, his eyes wide with a volatile mix of embarrassment, panic, and stubborn pride. The trap had been laid right in front of him, but his ego was already too far gone to accept the rescue. You always do this, Colton exploded, slamming his palm onto the teak table so hard the china rattled. Sienna didn't move an inch. She just sat there, watching the fracture spread. Every single time I try to build something of my own, you pull out a contract, a spreadsheet, or a legal opinion to shoot it down. The finance degree, wrong university. The venture in Fort Worth, too risky. Every damn time you have to be the smartest man in the room, and I'm just supposed to nod like an idiot. I'm protecting you from a predatory trap, Colton, I said, my voice dropping into a razor-thin register. That isn't an opinion. It's an undeniable financial fact. You're not protecting me. You're controlling me. His voice cracked, the pride and humiliation boiling over in front of his girlfriend and his mother. Eleanor reached for his arm, pleading softly for him to sit down, to let the dinner end in peace, but he shoved her hand away. His eyes were bloodshot, wet with rage. You don't believe in me. You've never believed in me. You think I'm still 10 years old wrecking an ATV in the pasture. And I am so sick of living under your thumb. That isn't fair. Son, I said, feeling the heat finally touch my chest, though my tone stayed dead flat. I've backed you since the day you were born. But backing you and handing $240,000 to a phantom syndicate with an unlimited liability clause are two very different things. Trust isn't your issue, Dad. Control is. He stood up, towering over the table, his fists trembling at his sides. You know what? I wish you'd never been my father. I wish I'd had a dad who actually let me live my own life. 26 years, every scraped knee, every late-night hospital run, every tuition check, every hour of 60-hour work weeks. And that was the invoice he handed me on Father's Day. The patio went dead quiet. Even the wind through the oak trees seemed to stop. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sienna just watched, calculating the damage. I stood up slowly, picked up my cloth napkin, folded it into a neat square, and laid it beside my half-eaten plate. I looked my son dead in the eye. Then live as if you never had one, I whispered. I turned on my heel and walked away. Past Sienna's wide, cold eyes, past Eleanor crying my name in a voice I hadn't heard since her father's funeral, out through the side gate into the driveway. Sitting there in the Texas sun was the custom black Ford F-250 King Ranch, a $60,000 truck Colton had been driving for over a year. A truck I'd let him use as a courtesy, keeping the title under my corporate fleet account until he earned it. I opened the door, climbed inside, cranked the engine, and backed out down the driveway without looking back. My phone buzzed on the console before I reached the end of the block. Bring my car back right now, Dad, or I'm calling the police. I stopped at the red light on Preston Road, typed 4 words back, and set the phone face down. It was never yours. I spent the night at the Omni Hotel in downtown Dallas, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the city hum below. I didn't sleep. A man doesn't sleep when he's just severed the tether to his only son. Eleanor called 9 times. I let it go to voicemail because a man needs at least one night to let his anger settle into iron before he speaks to his wife. At 9 o'clock Monday morning, I pulled the F-250 back into my driveway in Highland Park. Sitting right in front of my stone gates was a marked city police cruiser. Lights off, but the sight of a squad car sitting outside my home on a Monday morning felt like a stain on 30 years of building a clean name. Colton was standing on the porch, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, looking like he hadn't slept a minute either. Sienna was nowhere to be seen. A young officer, Hendricks, according to his name tag, stood on the steps, notepad in hand, looking thoroughly exhausted by rich family drama. "There he is," Colton barked as I stepped out of the truck. "Officer, that's him. That's the man who stole my vehicle out of the driveway yesterday." Officer Hendricks looked at me, then at Colton, his jaw set in that particular patience worn by law enforcement officers dealing with entitled kids. "Sir," Hendricks asked me politely, "is this truck registered in your name?" I didn't answer with words. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the registration folder I'd taken from the glove box the night before, and handed it to the officer. "The vehicle is titled to Vance Auto Group LLC," I said, my voice calm and steady as granite. "I am Garrett Vance, the sole managing member and owner of Vance Auto Group. My son has been operating the truck as a company courtesy. He resigned from my dealership 3 months ago, which terminated that courtesy." "I didn't resign, Dad," Colton started, his voice cracking. "You walked off the lot in March, Colton," I cut in coldly. Officer Hendricks examined the state registration, looked at the corporate tax ID, and let out a long, quiet breath. He handed the papers back to me and turned to Colton. "Son," the officer said, his tone firm and completely unamused, "the vehicle is legally owned by a corporation, and your father is the owner of that corporation. There is no vehicle theft here. This is a civil corporate matter. Do not call emergency dispatch for a civil dispute again." The officer tipped his hat to me, walked back to his cruiser, and drove away. Colton stood on the porch, his face burning a dark, humiliated crimson under the bright Texas sun. Neighbors down the street were out walking their dogs, staring at the scene. "You humiliated me," Colton rasped, his fists clenching at his sides. "You humiliated your own son over a truck. I didn't humiliate you." "Colton, you humiliated yourself when you called the police on your own father over a car you didn't own." For a brief second, the anger dropped out of his face, leaving him looking like the terrified teenager who had wrecked his first truck in our back pasture. I almost stepped forward. The part of me that had spent 26 years shielding him wanted to fix it. Then his phone vibrated in his hand, a harsh, violent buzz that shattered the silence. Colton glanced down at the screen. The color didn't just leave his face. It drained out so fast he stumbled backward against the porch railing. "Colton?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "What is it?" He didn't speak. He just turned the phone toward me, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it. It was a push notification from his personal bank account, followed by an urgent text alert from a high-interest private lending app. "Transaction failed, account frozen, 71,000. Reason, recipient, account closing, suspected fraud." The whole picture laid itself out instantly. "You sent the money," I whispered, the cold clarity washing over me. "Before Father's Day, before you even asked me at the table." I sent my savings," Colton stammered, his voice breaking entirely into a pathetic sob. "50,000 from my personal account, and 21,000 from a short-term credit line." Sienna said, "She said the allocation in Austin was closing on Friday. She said if I wired my share early, her friends would guarantee our spot." "And where is Sienna now, Colton?" He frantically tapped his screen, dialing her number. "The party you are trying to reach has been disconnected or is no longer in service." He opened his messaging app. Her profile picture was gone, her social accounts deleted, her location turned off. She had ghosted him completely the moment the bank flagged the fraudulent wire. He had drained his entire life savings and taken on high-interest debt for a woman who treated him like a mark, using him to pipeline my family's wealth into a phantom scam. Colton dropped to his knees right there on the porch, staring at the blank screen of his phone, completely destroyed. The $71,000 was gone. His girlfriend was gone. His pride was gone. I stood at the bottom of the steps, looking down at my son. My heart felt heavy enough to sink through the concrete, but I didn't reach out to pick him up. "You wanted to live like you never had a father, Colton," I said quietly, turning toward the front door. "Now you get to figure out how to survive like one." The financial aftermath hit my son with the ruthless velocity of an oncoming freight train. Within 48 hours of Sienna vanishing into thin air, Colton's curated luxury existence imploded line by line. The high-interest private lending app he'd tapped for $21,000 began firing off aggressive collection notices, slapping daily penalty fees onto a debt he had no way of servicing. Then came the formal eviction filing from his upscale high-rise apartment near Victory Park. He'd put down his security deposit and first month's rent using a secondary credit card that was now completely maxed out. Overdrawn, stripped of his vehicle, facing a ruinous credit score, and staring directly into the abyss of personal bankruptcy, Colton finally did what every spoiled child does when the ground disappears beneath them. He ran back to the man he had disowned. He didn't come to the house in Highland Park. He didn't dare face his mother. He came directly to the flagship dealership of Vance Heavy Machinery on Industrial Boulevard. I was sitting in my glass-walled executive office on a scorching Thursday afternoon when my sales manager, Greg, tapped on the doorframe. Greg looked uneasy, rubbing the back of his neck. "Garrett, Colton's out on the floor. He's been standing by the service bay entrance for 20 minutes. He wouldn't come in past the reception desk without asking. Let him wait another 10 minutes, Greg." I said without looking up from my inventory ledger. Petty? Maybe. But a man who spends 30 years shielding his son from the brutal friction of the real world earns the right to let that son sit in the heat and think about his choices. When I finally stepped out onto the showroom floor, Colton looked utterly wrecked. Not the dramatic, performative wreck he pulled at the Father's Day dinner table, but real, bone-deep exhaustion. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unwashed, and his eyes held the haunted, hollow glare of a man who hadn't slept in a week. "Dad," he rasped, taking a tentative step forward. Can we talk in your office? Privately?" "This is where I work, Colton," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the humming air conditioning of the showroom. "If you've got something to say to me, you can say it right here, just like any other man who walks onto this lot looking for a resolution." He flinched as if I'd struck him, but the desperation in his chest kept him anchored to the floor tiles. "The money's gone, Dad. All of it." Sienna wiped her accounts and turned off her phone. "The short-term lender is threatening to attach a lien to my bank account, and my landlord filed for eviction yesterday. I'm maxed out. I'm drowning. Dad, please, I'm asking you for help. Just write a check to clear the debt. I'll pay you back every single cent. I swear I will." I looked down at my only son, feeling a profound, heavy ache in my ribs. A younger, softer version of Garrett Vance would have already reached for his leather checkbook. But I'd learned more in the past 4 days than I had in 26 years. Handing a boy money to clean up a mess he made out of sheer hubris doesn't save him. It dooms him. "No," I said, my voice dead level, entirely devoid of anger or warmth. Colton blinked, stunned, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "No, Colton, I am not bailing you out. You stood in my home and told me you wished I had never been your father. You called the police on me over a truck you didn't own. Fathers don't hand over $71,000 to cover up the consequences of a con artist and the arrogant boy who let her use him. You wanted to live without a father? Live without one. Figure out the rent. Figure out the lender. Figure out your life. Dad, please!" His voice cracked wide open, tears spilling over his dusty cheeks in front of my employees. "I'll lose the apartment. I'll have nowhere to go. I'll be on the street." "Your mother's guest bedroom is made up," I replied coldly, turning my back on him. "That is the absolute extent of what you get from this family right now. A clean bed and a warm meal. Not a single dollar. Now get off my showroom floor." Eleanor grieved for him, of course. She was a mother, and her heart broke seeing her boy stripped of his pride. But Eleanor was also a Texas woman who trusted her husband's judgment. When Colton dragged his 2 remaining duffel bags into our Highland Park home that evening, Eleanor laid down the absolute law. He could sleep in his childhood bedroom, and he could eat whatever was in the refrigerator. But she would not give him 1 cent of cash, nor would she buy him a bus pass. To cover the immediate, predatory interest fees on his high-risk loan, Colton was forced to make his first real sacrifice. He took the gold Omega watch his grandfather had given him for his high school graduation, a prized family heirloom, and walked it into a pawn shop off Harry Hines Boulevard, selling it for a fraction of its worth just to keep the collections agency off his back for 30 days. By Friday afternoon, reality compelled him to take the only job that would hire a college dropout with no references on 48 hours' notice. Waiting tables on the grueling late-night shift at a high-end steakhouse in uptown Dallas. For 2 weeks, I watched my son move through my house like a ghost. He wore a stiff black work shirt, his hands were covered in minor grease burns from heavy sizzle platters, and his shoulders slouched under the weight of minimum wage plus tips. He didn't ask me for money again. He didn't even look me in the eye when we passed each other in the kitchen at 1 a.m. Then came the second Thursday of his second week. The night the social universe he had tried so desperately to impress brought its full crushing weight down on his neck. It was 10:30 p.m. at the packed Uptown Steakhouse. Colton was clearing dishes near the back dining patio when the matron assigned him to a primary party of 8 in the center booth. Colton smoothed down his apron, grabbed his order pad, and stepped up to the table, his breath caught in his throat, his entire body locked up. Sitting in the plush leather booth, laughing over bottle service and high-end cuts of Wagyu, were 6 of his former fraternity brothers from SMU and 2 girls he had dated in college, the exact inner circle of wealthy, privileged Dallas elite he had spent his 20s trying to emulate. Sitting right at the head of the table was Chad Montgomery, a trust fund heir whose father competed directly with my heavy equipment business. The table went completely quiet as Chad looked up, recognizing the waiter holding the water pitcher. A slow, mocking grin spread across Chad's face. "Well, well, well," Chad drawled, leaning back and snapping his fingers so the rest of the table would pay attention. "Look who's taking our orders tonight, if it isn't Colton Vance, the big real estate mogul himself." The table erupted into muffled snickers. Colton stood there, his face burning with a shame so hot it felt like acid pouring down his spine. "Good evening," Colton whispered, his knuckles white against his pad. Are we ready to order drinks?" "Oh, we're ready, man," Chad sneered, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. "Word on the street was you got completely wiped out by some girl from Austin. Heard your old man took your truck back, threw you out of Highland Park and left you to dry. We didn't believe it until right now. What happened to that Lone Star Syndicate, Vance? Didn't work out?" One of the girls turned her head away, giggling quietly behind her silk napkin. Colton stood frozen under the harsh dining lights, completely exposed, stripped of his expensive clothes, his luxury vehicle, and the protective armor of his father's name. For 26 years, he had believed the world respected him for who he was. In that agonizing, brutal minute, he finally realized the terrifying truth. The world had only ever respected his father's money. Without Garrett Vance standing behind him, he was just a servant clearing their dirty glasses. I'll give you guys a few more minutes," Colton choked out, turning blindly toward the kitchen doors. "Hey, Colton," Chad called out loudly across the dining room, slapping a crumpled $20 bill onto the table. "Make sure you bring extra bread rolls, buddy. Leave the butter. We know you need the tip." Colton pushed through the swinging metal doors of the kitchen, collapsed against the stainless steel prep counter in the back corner, and squeezed his eyes shut as his chest heaved with dry, silent sobs. For the first time in his entire life, my son tasted the absolute, unvarnished cruelty of a world that offers zero mercy to a man who falls. And for the first time, he realized that the father he had hated for being strict was the only human being on earth who had ever truly stood between him and total destruction. 4 days after Colton's humiliating encounter at the Uptown Steakhouse, the heavy shadow hanging over my garage finally shifted from blind shame to unvarnished truth. I hadn't been sitting on my hands while my son washed grease off stainless steel trays. The second I smelled a shell scheme on Father's Day, I made a call to an old friend, Roger Bell, a retired senior investigator with the Texas Department of Public Safety, who now ran a private financial forensics firm in Fort Worth. Roger and I went back 30 years, to the days when I was still greasing axles on my first 3 haulers. When I handed him Sienna Croft's name, her digital footprint, and the wire details for Lone Star Asset Group, Roger didn't just run a routine check. He dug straight into state and federal fraud registries. The file Roger delivered to my office on Monday morning was 50 pages of cold, predatory perfection. Sienna Croft wasn't an ambitious Austin socialite who got caught up in a bad investment. She was an operative, a professional front door for an organized financial syndicate run by a woman named Michelle Voss out of San Antonio. Their playbook was elegant, repeatable, and merciless. Sienna's sole job was to target wealthy, insecure young men in major Texas metros, boys with access to family capital, big egos, and an urgent desire to prove they didn't need their fathers. She would move into their lives, build an illusion of exclusive romance, and slowly plant high-yield opportunities. Once the mark took the bait, she would apply just enough emotional pressure to force a rush funding, collect her 30% recruiter cut from the dummy escrow account, and vanish into the ether before the family ever realized a crime had been committed. Roger had traced the exact same pattern through 3 prior victims: a rancher's heir in San Antonio 18 months ago, an oil executive's youngest son in Midland, and a real estate heir in Houston. Over $400,000 siphoned, 0 criminal charges filed, because every single young man had been too embarrassed by his own foolishness to report the fraud to law enforcement. That evening, I stepped out into the garage. The August heat was thick, humming off the concrete floor. Colton was sitting on an overturned plastic crate beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by a mountain of paperwork, collection notices from the lending app, maxed out credit card statements, and crumpled printouts of his text conversations with Sienna. He was staring at a legal pad covered in numbers that wouldn't balance no matter how many times he rewrote them. He jumped when my shadow fell across the concrete, instinctively trying to cover the papers with his hands. "Dad, I didn't hear you come out. You keeping those for a reason, Colton? I asked, my voice calm, neutral, free of judgment. He let his hands drop, his shoulders slumping in defeat. A reminder, I guess. A $71,000 reminder of what an absolute idiot looks like on paper. He dragged a palm over his face. The wire address, it wasn't even a real escrow account, Dad. Roger from the bank checked the routing number yesterday. It was just a personal checking account registered to an LLC in Nevada. There are no properties in Travis County. There is no Lone Star Syndicate. It was all fake. I know, I said quietly, leaning against the workbench. I've known since the week before Father's Day. Colton's head snapped up, a flicker of old hurt flashing in his tired eyes. You knew? You knew it was a scam and you still let me sit at your dinner table and beg you for $240,000? I tried to stop you at my own table, son, I replied coldly. I slid the contract across the linen tablecloth. I highlighted the personal guarantee clause. And you stood up, slammed your hands down, and told me you wished I had never been your father, because you thought I was trying to keep you small. He flinched as if I'd thrown a punch, but he didn't argue. The fight had been completely beaten out of him. I called Roger Bell last week. I continued, pulling a blue folder from my jacket and setting it on the workbench beside his legal pad. Sienna Croft isn't her real name. It's an alias she's used in 3 different Texas cities. She didn't fall for you, Colton. You weren't her partner, you were her target. She's part of a ring that specializes in finding soft, privileged boys with rich fathers and using their pride to open their family's vault. Roger checked her location history. She paid a deposit on her new apartment in Miami 2 weeks before Father's Day. She knew she was burning you to the ground before you ever sat down at my table. Colton stared at the blue folder, his skin going paper white under the garage lights. The final piece of his fantasy shattered into dust right there on the concrete. She planned it the whole time, he whispered, his voice cracking violently. She sat next to my mother, ate her food, and knew she was taking everything I had. Yes, I said, and she got away with it 3 times before because every boy she targeted was too proud, too ashamed, to stand up and admit he'd been played. Colton buried his face in his hands, his chest heaving with silent, heavy sobs. I'm an idiot, Dad. I destroyed my life for a woman who treated me like a mark. I'm broke, I'm waiting tables for $20 an hour, and I'm sitting in my childhood garage at 26 years old. I watched my son cry, not the dramatic, angry tears of a spoiled child denied a favor, but the bitter, cleansing tears of a man who had finally hit rock bottom and realized the wall he'd slammed into was entirely of his own making. I didn't reach out to pat his back. I didn't offer a handkerchief. I let him feel the full weight of the truth. What Colton didn't know, what I kept entirely to myself, was the secret offensive I had launched 36 hours prior. I hadn't written a $71,000 check to pay off his bad choices. Doing that would have killed the hard-earned wisdom currently taking root in his chest. But I sure as hell wasn't going to let a pair of career predators walk away from my family untouched. The previous afternoon, my corporate attorney and I had met privately with the Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas in downtown Dallas. I had personally underwritten Roger Bell's investigative expenses and turned over the complete forensic dossier, IP logs, wire routing data, time-stamped surveillance photos, and bank records spanning 3 counties. Because the money had crossed state lines into Nevada and Florida, we packaged the case not as a simple civil dispute, but as a textbook federal wire fraud and interstate racketeering, RICO indictment. The U.S. Attorney had opened an active federal case file before I left the building. Federal arrest warrants were already being drawn up for Sienna Croft and Michelle Voss. They were going to prison, and federal asset forfeiture teams would eventually seize every dime they had stolen across the state of Texas. But I made one thing crystal clear to my legal team and the federal prosecutors. Colton's name would remain on the civil docket for his private high-interest loan. I wasn't going to bail him out. He was going to keep working that late-night shift at the steakhouse. He was going to hand over every tip dollar to pay off his $21,000 credit line, week by week, month by month, until the debt he signed his own name to was completely wiped clean. The law would put the predators in a federal cell, but hard labor and accountability would turn my son into a man. I looked down at Colton as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The scammers are being handled. Son, I said softly, my tone firm as steel. But your debts belong to you. You signed the paperwork. You took the loan. You're going to work that job until every cent you borrowed is paid back to the penny. Colton looked up at me through bloodshot eyes, pulled a deep, shaky breath into his lungs, and nodded. Okay, Dad. Okay. I'll pay it back. Every single dollar. For the first time in 26 years, he didn't ask for a shortcut. And as I turned and walked back into the house, I knew that for all the damage Sienna Croft had done, she had accidentally unlocked the one thing 30 years of my money could never buy. The beginning of my son's real character. 3 full weeks of double shifts at the Uptown Steakhouse had carved away every last trace of Colton's former vanity. His hands, once soft and pristine from years of unearned comfort, were calloused and marked with minor hot plate burns. Every night, after bussing tables until 1 a.m. under the mocking gazes of his former college peers, he walked back into his childhood bedroom in Highland Park, surrounded by his old high school football trophies, and slept the heavy, dreamless sleep of an exhausted laborer. He didn't complain. He didn't ask his mother for spending cash. He took his weekly tip envelopes straight to the credit union off Turtle Creek Boulevard, handing over every single dollar to satisfy the minimum monthly payments on his high-interest loan. On a quiet Sunday evening, while Eleanor was at a community board meeting, I walked out to the back patio. The North Texas heat had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, quiet breeze. Colton was sitting at the edge of the stone pool, his black work boots unlaced, staring blankly at the water. I sat down on the teak bench behind him. "You look tired, son." Colton didn't jump this time. He slowly turned his head, his face thinner, his eyes holding a quiet, grounded depth I had never seen in 26 years. He pulled his feet out of the water and wiped his palms against his jeans. "I am tired, Dad," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "For 26 years. I thought waking up at 5 in the morning and running dealerships was just something you did because you liked being in charge. I thought making money was easy, that it just flowed because you had a big name in Dallas. 3 weeks of carrying tray after tray for people who used to be my friends. 3 weeks of counting every nickel just to pay off a predator, and I finally get it." Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling freely down his cheeks. But these weren't the bitter, angry tears of Father's Day, nor were they the panicked sobs of a boy who had lost his savings. They were the cleansing tears of absolute, unvarnished humility. "You weren't trying to control me, Dad," Colton choked out, burying his face in his rough hands. "Every time you asked for a spreadsheet, every time you pulled out a contract, every time you told me no, you weren't trying to keep me small. You were trying to build a shield around me. You knew how brutal this world is to a man who thinks he's smart when he's actually blind. And I stood in front of Mom, in front of that woman, and told you I wished you never existed. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so damn sorry." I sat in silence for a long moment, listening to my son weep beside the pool. The ache in my chest was heavy, but beneath it, I felt a quiet, profound relief. The arrogance was gone. The illusion was dead. In its place stood a young man who finally understood the real weight of a dollar and the true cost of honor. "I have something to show you, Colton," I said, rising from the bench. "Come inside to my study." He wiped his face, pulled on his boots, and followed me into the house. I opened the heavy mahogany desk where I kept the corporate records for Vance Heavy Machinery. I unlocked the bottom drawer, pulled out 2 thick leather-bound folders, and laid them out on the desk before him. Folder 1 contained the original, signed state title to the black Ford F-250 King Ranch, dated 6 months prior, with Colton's name listed as the sole transferee. Folder 2 was an official bank trust ledger from Northern Trust in Dallas. "Back in January, long before Sienna Croft ever stepped onto my patio," I said, pointing at the documents, "I had my corporate attorneys draw up the final paperwork to transfer the King Ranch to you outright as a 26th birthday present. And this second folder is a private educational and business trust fund I established for you on the day you turned 18. It holds $200,000. Colton stared at the leather folders, his jaw dropping in utter disbelief. His eyes darted from the title to the $200,000 balance statement, then up to my face. You had all of this?" Colton whispered, his voice cracking violently. "The whole time I was begging you at the dinner table? The whole time I was living in this house, selling Grandpa's watch to pay off credit cards, waiting tables until 2 in the morning? You had a $200,000 trust sitting in your desk drawer?" "I did," I replied evenly. "Why didn't you just give it to me?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and residual pain. "Why did you let me go through all of this?" "Because a father who hands his son a check the second he cries doesn't teach him anything except that crying works," I said, my tone as solid as Texas granite. "You didn't lose your right to this trust because you failed, Colton. You lost it because you hadn't proven you were trustworthy. If I had written you a check on Father's Day, you would have handed it straight to Sienna Croft, wiped out your future, and learned absolutely nothing. 3 weeks of hard labor, an empty bank account, and a sold watch taught you more about survival than $200,000 of my money ever could." Colton dropped his head, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "You're right, Dad. God help me. You're completely right. Now hear me clearly, son," I continued, leaning over the desk and locking my eyes onto his. "That $200,000 is still sitting in that trust, but the rules have permanently changed. The days of unearned handoffs are over." I pulled a blank legal pad and a pen out of my drawer and set them firmly in front of him. "If you ever want to touch a single dime of that trust, You are going to earn it from the ground up, I declared, introducing the challenge. Here is my condition. You are going to write a complete, bulletproof business plan for a specialized commercial truck parts and hydraulic servicing dealership. A small independent operation. I don't want fluff or marketing buzzwords. I want location demographics, supplier margins, inventory turnover schedules, and 5-year cash flow projections. Colton looked down at the blank legal pad, a sharp spark of determination igniting in his eyes. And it doesn't end with a paper plan, I added, holding up 2 fingers. First, your business plan has to survive a brutal, 3-hour interrogation in this study where I pick every single line item apart, just like a commercial bank board would. Second, you will not receive a full grant. The trust will cover 80% of your startup capital. The remaining 20%, $40,000, must come directly out of your own pocket, saved from your own wages at the steakhouse and your future earnings. You will put your own skin in the game, or the doors stay locked. Colton looked at the blank pad, then at the trust folder, and finally at me. For the first time in his life, he didn't look for a shortcut. He didn't ask for a lower threshold. He reached out, picked up the pen, and looked me dead in the eye with a mature, unshakable resolve. That's fair, Dad, Colton said, his voice completely steady. That's more than fair. Give me 2 months. I'll bring you a business plan that can survive anything. A father doesn't win by giving his children everything they demand. I found at 58 years old there is a far deeper, sharper victory in making a young man earn back the legacy you were always planning to leave him anyway. 6 months can feel like a brief blip in a man's lifetime, or it can feel like the slow, grueling forge where an entirely new human being is hammered out of raw iron. For Colton, those 6 months were a relentless march of discipline, sweat, and absolute accountability. He kept his job at the Uptown Steakhouse, working 5 late-night shifts a week without missing a single call time. Every Monday morning, like clockwork, he walked into the credit union off Turtle Creek Boulevard and handed over his earnings. Dollar by dollar, tip envelope by tip envelope, he chipped away at his high-interest loan until the remaining $21,000 of predatory debt was paid off down to the exact last cent. He didn't stop there. He spent his free hours sitting at my mahogany dining table, surrounded by commercial equipment trade catalogs, supply chain ledgers, and financial projection software. He didn't ask me for advice, and he didn't ask his mother to review his drafts. He researched hydraulic hose suppliers across the Midwest, mapped out traffic flow density along the industrial corridors of South Dallas, and calculated real-world inventory depreciation margins. On a crisp February morning, 6 months after he'd dropped to his knees on my front porch, Colton walked into my study. He wasn't wearing his old designer clothes, nor was he wearing his greasy steakhouse apron. He wore a simple, tailored dark suit he'd bought with his own saved money. He set a heavy black leather binder on my desk and sat down across from me, not as a son begging his father for a handout, but as an entrepreneur presenting a commercial venture to a prospective investor. "I'm ready, Garrett," he said, using my name in a professional capacity for the very first time. For 3 intense hours, we sat in that study. I didn't hold back out of paternal fondness. I attacked his 5-year cash flow projections, questioned his labor allocation ratios, and picked apart his supplier credit terms just as relentlessly as any commercial loan officer in Texas would. Colton didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't get defensive, and he didn't offer vague excuses. He knew every single number because he had researched every single line item himself. He had built a bulletproof, razor-sharp business plan for a specialized hydraulic hose and heavy equipment servicing depot in South Dallas. More importantly, he pulled out his personal savings statement from the local bank, $8,000 saved entirely from his steakhouse wages over the past 6 months, added to the money he had managed to recover from selling his own secondary assets. Combined with his debt payoff, he had officially put his own skin in the game. When the 3 hours were up, I closed the black binder, set my reading glasses on the desk, and looked across at my son. The entitled boy who had stood on my patio demanding $240,000 for a phantom scam was completely gone. Sitting across from me was a 27-year-old Texas businessman who understood the value of labor, the weight of honor, and the absolute necessity of a solid foundation. For the first time in 6 long, painful months, I let a genuine, warm smile break across my face. "You built a hell of a business plan, Colton," I said quietly. I picked up my pen, opened the Northern Trust ledger, and signed the official authorization releasing the $200,000 trust fund into an operating account for Vance Hydraulic and Equipment Services. Then I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out the brass key fob for the black Ford F-250 King Ranch, and slid it across the polished mahogany wood. Colton looked down at the keys, then up at me, his eyes brimming with quiet, dignified emotion. He didn't jump up in wild celebration. He reached out, picked up the keys, and gripped them tightly in his hand. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his voice steady and deeply grounded. Not just for the keys, but for letting me fall until I learned how to stand. You earned them back, son, I replied, rising from my chair to extend my hand. Now go build something that lasts. Looking back on the entire storm from the quiet comfort of my porch in Highland Park, I know some folks might say I was too hard on my boy. They might think 60 days of silence, letting him lose his savings, and making him wait tables in front of his wealthy peers was overly cruel for a father who could have easily cleared his debts with the stroke of a pen. But those people don't understand what it takes to raise a man who can survive in a brutal world. Some men win by taking things away and holding a lifelong grudge. I found at 58 years old there is a far deeper, sharper kind of winning in making a man earn back what you were always going to give him anyway. You don't save a child by insulating him from the fire. You save him by letting the heat burn away his vanity until only pure iron remains. Today, Colton runs a thriving, profitable equipment depot in South Dallas. He pays his employees on time, audits his contracts down to the fine print, and drives his King Ranch with the quiet pride of a man who knows nobody gave him a free pass. He knows who he is, and he knows that as long as I breathe, his father will always have his back. Not as a piggy bank, but as a rock. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Texas grit, tough love, and the real price of earning back a family legacy. If Garrett's journey resonated with you and reminded you of the values that truly matter, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming audio dramas. Drop a comment down below and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from today. I read every single one of your messages. Until next time, keep your standards high, protect your family's name, and take good care of yourselves out there.